Thank you very much for such a rich presentation that I'm sure there's a lot of food for thought for all of us. I have kind of one comment and a couple of questions, and then I will pass to everyone. I have the impression that in your text, you present Adorno as the analysand himself. And I don't know if it is because your position or your training as an analyst, but I hear this singular universality that he conveys very clearly in his reflection in Minima Moralia particularly. And it just impacted me quite sharply. Yeah, that this kind of really deep introspection from the position of the excluded unconscious. Mm-hmm. That's a comment. And I wanted to ask you, in terms of the malignant normativity, how is that related to the death drive, or why not calling the death drive? That's one question. And the other is, what could be the conditions that could allow socially the project of redemption, or this ability to really look into the reflection of the experience, pretty much?
Death drive, I'm pretty sure Adorno never talks about that. When he talks Freud, he talks sexuality, aggression, destructiveness, but not death drive. So do you want to say more of how that comes to your mind here?
Yes, well, obviously it's coming from my Lacanian perspective, that for Lacan, the death drive, it's the drive, right? It's the erotic drive, and its excess leads to the death drive, right? It's the drive by itself, it has the entropy or the entropic quality that leads to excess and destruction, right? In that sense, even he calls the libido leads to the strudo, right? So I was thinking that the malignant normality had like at the core the death drive, and I was wondering if for Adorno had some
I suppose
resonance.
you could say that from that perspective, that the death drive is driving the trajectory of history.
Yes.
But I think Adorno would say more it's the increasing concentration of capital and the destructive social conditions that are driving it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe the materialization of the
so.
drive through the social and the economic model.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yes. And the redemption, is there any thought about the redemption? What could be the conditions for a project of redemption, if any?
You know, I really tried to, I think it's really there in Minima Moralia, I really tried to emphasize that as far as Adorno seems to be concerned, I experience this room, I look at it in connection with the structure of university life, et cetera, and I, from whatever resources of my complexity of my experience, I have the sense it could be different in a better way. And that's what the perspective of redemption is. I think it's not it's a very tantalizing word, but I don't think it's meant to be, it's meant to be difficult, almost impossible, but it's not meant to be mystifying, and maybe it turns out mystifying.
Okay.
There are probably other people have stuff to say about that.
Definitely. Yeah. And if you wait for the microphone so it can be recorded. Thank you.
Picking up on this theme, you were thinking of death instinct, and I was thinking something else. Malignant normalcy is, to me, life preservative drive. Something that Freud talked about early in his writings, but then left after the 1920 and the Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where he talked about the death instinct and life instinct, but the dual model of the mind. Now, I bring this up because not everybody left the life preservative instincts. In fact, Chandra Ferenczi wrote about it extensively much later in his career, and considered that that was one of the driving forces that push individuals towards compromises in health. Like a psychosis could be life preservative drive. Compromise, which makes life possible, is certainly something that we can all identify with. But Freud didn't write about it very much. And I recognized redemption in a film I saw recently. Terrence Malick's new film, A Hidden Life, in which...
What's it called again?
A Hidden Life, 2019. I saw it at the Film Fest. I'm not going to tell you the plot, but it's an instance where a person has to exhibit tremendous courage of conviction to resist malignant normalcy.
Yeah. I mean, Samir was talking about this beforehand, that if the person wants to survive, they have to participate, and that has consequences for them. And it's, yeah. And Adorno's describing that for the intellectual. Yeah.
Well, funnily enough, that's essentially what I wanted to ask about. So my question will come just after a preface with a kind of comment, which I think is really there's a very resonant passage from one of Adorno's lectures on negative dialectics. I think it was like 1965 or something, 66, where he says that he really didn't consider negativity as playing such an important role in his thinking until his years of exile, where he noticed that there was this compulsion to, and he uses the term, identify with the aggressor. And so negativity was about resistance, right? It was resisting this compulsion to identify with essentially the status quo. And you know, in We Refugees, Arendt has some very interesting things to say on a very sort of in a parallel way about the kind of exigencies and the compulsions of being an emigre. And I think this was really, really quite fascinating in the context of a text, now thinking about Minima Moralia, where he's thinking so much about homelessness, about dwelling, about writing. And you correctly point out that he sort of poses the possibility of dwelling in one's writing, but then he takes it away for the reasons you pointed out. But I think that posing and offering, in a sense, taking away, means something interesting insofar as there's a question of style here. So he's refusing the kind of, identification with the aggressor at the level of style, at the level of, discourse, and there's a different kind of style that is insisted upon, which you see. I mean, this is a beautifully written text. It's aphoristic, and he writes, as you've translated, the essay as form, and his insistence on a paratactical style. These are forms of resistance, aren't they? So there's that stylistic dimension. But when he talks about education after Auschwitz, he talks about education specifically for contradiction, Widerspruch, and resistance. So I think that there's both this kind of, attempt to engage in pedagogy, right? You gave the example of the students, and there's an attempt to open up the discourse, open up the style, but then there's this more philosophical and literary hermetic dimension. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
That's nice. I like that. I was thinking about the aphoristic things, or the things I call constellations, where there will be several things that you can connect with association, but the associations are not spelled out, and they're juxtaposed in a way, which is a little bit like, and who was it that Ed was saying about the weapon of the quote in the middle of the paragraph, which I thought was a great image. So it's like he'll put this out and he'll say, okay, or you have to make the connection here. I'll put this out. Well, did you get that one? Now try this one. It makes demands on the reader, I think is one way of saying it. And when he talks in the music, the pedagogical music essay, about what the listener has to do is follow the music, and actually uses the word co-compose. The listener has to co-compose the music or recompose it afterwards, right after, create the structure in his own mind, which is like encouraging contradiction, encouraging resistance.
And releases too.
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah.
Jerry.
Just a few points, Shierry. It's bracing to hear you talk about the individual. Those of us who started reading Adorno in the 60s, not completely understanding where he was going in a disciplinary way. That is to say, is this sociology? Is it psychology, right? You know this. What are we reading? What are we trying to understand with this person who's probably in the future will be looked back as the most important figure, I think, in 20th century political thought and aesthetic thought, and in your terms, how one understands the resistance. But it seems like what you've done is bring back the individual in a way, which was Adorno's difficulty. How do you talk, I mean, even in his Kierkegaard study, you remember the power-protected individual, right, is so deeply ingrained, embedded, even in the Enlightenment, that it requires a different way of thinking, about where we are, not only in terms of fascism, but in terms of intellectual thought itself. And I think you've brought out something extremely important about that Adorno could see miles away the causes of the disintegration of the individual, right? He felt it in himself. He felt the suffering in himself. At some point, I think in Negative Dialectics, he says something like, "We are free to suffer, but not to inflict suffering on others. But we have to have that freedom in ourselves to understand what this suffering is all about, right?" But what I took from what you said there in terms of Charlotte Berat, those dreams, and I've written something about those dreams not fairly recently.
Yeah.
If anyone, those dreams were about the past as well as not just prognostic about the future. Bettelheim and Koselleck read those dreams in some ways as prognostic of the Holocaust, of the genocide, which could not be prophesized. It could not be possibly predicted. But what those dreams did for Berat is to show that there was a continuity with the past and the unpast, which the individual in that particular culture and time had resisted understanding after World War I. Does that make any sense?
It makes sense. I was not aware of it reading them, but it's an interesting thing.
She quotes Kafka, she quotes Brecht, she quotes Arendt, she quotes Simone Weil, as if to say those dreams were prognostic prognosticated the most heinous possible acts that human beings could imagine.
Their dreams, the ones I quoted, are just right from 1933, 1934. So, and you would have imagined they were from much later, but they're right away, so they're prognostic in that sense.
But they were, as you pointed out in that wonderful phrase, what they did is point out in everyday life the malignant narcissism of the system itself.
Yeah.
But they had no language, no political, social language, because the institutions themselves could not frame the language in itself. So the dreamers were left, the dream was undreamt in terms of the way in which these dreams could possibly have been understood by those people who were being humiliated, ashamed in everyday life. Right, that's my point. And Adorno is so sensitive to the fact that individuals in their everyday life are being humiliated, insulted, ashamed, and they don't know why. And the identification with the commodity system has prevented that kind of insight into understanding, well, why is this happening to me?
Yeah.
Why do I feel like this? Right? It's a footnote to what you said.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. That was really great. Reminded me of the Adorno I've read. Now, I haven't read him in the original German. So one of the things I'm curious about, as kind of also a footnote to what you were saying, is whether the word for experience that he uses is Erfahrung.
Oh, whether it's Erfahrung or Erlebnis,
Yeah.
you know, along with Benjamin. I actually don't know. I bet Samir would know, but he's not here. Do you know, Jerry? Erfahrung.
It's
okay.
Erfahrung, right?
As
Because
opposed to an Erlebnis, like a little specific
yeah,
experience.
because I think in English there's this ambiguity where experience means both of those, both lived experience and this kind of experience that you learn over time.
Right. I mean, I don't think in Minima Moralia, I mean, this is just an impression, that he speaks of an experience. I think he speaks of experience as the medium of life, if you like.
Right. No, I think I just wanted to kind of make that clarification, because otherwise we end up with Leibniz and therefore life philosophy or these kind of, and life philosophy is more or less what led to Nazism to begin with. So we can't privilege experience in a crude way, let's say.
Right, yeah.
If I could just add to this,
Please.
the connection of Erfahrung to journeying is really important in both Benjamin and Hegel. I think Adorno takes an Erfahrung.
Say that again.
The connection to journeying. Benjamin says, he was had an experience, has a story to tell. Has had
Okay,
a journey.
yeah.
So the root of a far is to travel.
Thank you for the talk. I just was wondering if you had any thoughts about previous discussions that we had here about the subject and kind of the Kantian subject and the Adorno's and Horkheim's critique of that sort of model of enlightenment, and then this question of where does the resistance come from in the face of malignant normalcy, and how maybe that's like, in what way do you see this sort of what was said here, this type of individuality that's resistant in even the slightest sort of ways, to what extent that is related or resists or informed by kind of that Kantian subject in negative ways or resisting ways?
I mean, people will probably want to say things about this also. It seems to me that Adorno is certainly emphasizing what I call the eccentric contingency of experience, which I don't know that Kant would talk about, right? On the other hand, Adorno certainly interested in talking about genuine truth, genuine morality, genuine thought. So he has a sense of some valid version of all those things, but they all have to be very mediated. Yeah. You want to say anything about
Yes, I wanted to follow up with my questions, and a little bit of Jerry points out the individual that you brought in your reading of Adorno, and how in the way you presented Adorno, it moves away from kind of a prescriptive psychology. I mean, I don't know Adorno that well in terms of the different periods of his writing or his own dialectics, but yeah, I'm familiar with several of his readings, or writings rather, my readings. But then it seems like he comes from a place at some point of, for example, in working through the past, right? Like, let's educate, this pedagogy. But in Minima Moralia, he's like, let that project like fall, in terms of it's about recuperating the experience of the individual that represents, in a way, all of us, certain universality. I was reading that, and my question about the redemption is not so much that I heard the mystification, but I wanted almost like emphasize this part of non-totality, right? Like, it's not that he is giving the solution, right? It's like, it's really difficult, he's kind of saying, right?
Yeah,
and
you'll get a hint, you'll get a whiff.
yes,
But
yeah.
the whiff will remind you, oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that, I think, that is, it's very important, and at the same time it's very difficult to hold, because we always tried heuristically to approach a phenomenon, to try to solve or to try to come with some solution, no?
Yes, right.
And he's just like putting there this dialectic and this difficulty and this contradiction, right?
Yeah, it's interesting, the word prescriptive. I'm reminded again of what I brought up after Samir's talk in the lecture about res radicalismus. And he says, he really gives a prescription. He says, don't try to appeal to their shame and their morale, that they should be good people. Talk to them about their real interests. Now, that's a prescription for activism, basically. And describe the propaganda tricks that they are using. Describe them the way you would in analysis. Describe the self-contradictory thought and feeling and behavior of the patient. So, and that's also an activity. I mean, that's the way in which the dialectical reflection is an active practice. That, yeah. Yeah.
Any other
Are we done?
We have time for some couple of more questions. Samir, again.
Yes.
This last point of yours, Shierry, also just reminds me of something I meant to say when you raised this notion of trying to address sort of objective interests of those who are attracted to the far right. I think another kind of prescription that comes out of the authoritarian personality study is that you can't actually engage in rational discourse with those who are, authoritarian or, leaning in that direction, because they see this as a sign of weakness, and it then becomes, in a sense, fuel to the fire. And I think that this is important today, because so much of the left has become, melancholic in Wendy Brown's analysis, that it has become so fixated on its own sense of victimhood. Victimhood becomes elevated into a kind of location from which to speak. Those who are more victimized have more time to speak. Everybody else has to sit down and shut up. Intrinsically, that's just bad, I think. But even more so, it seems to also then have this effect of fueling the fires of the far right and a kind of pouncing on perceived weakness. And I think so. I think there's much we can learn from this work on authoritarianism. Thanks for raising it.
I mean, it's also that you can't talk abstract reason with the far right because, as Adorno puts it, there is no actual platform. There's no connection with reality. It's a web of slogans around a delusion. I mean, this Rechtsradikalismus is really good. Except, I think it's only in German so far.
I think it's been translated by Paul.
Okay, good. Yeah. Yeah. Somebody? No.
Any last question? Comment?
We wore everybody
Yes,
out.
one more.
Yeah.
Okay, so this time to actually ask you a question. I wonder then how Adorno would see the link between experience and sociability or sociality, because you also made a point about him believing that sociability is malignant, right? Malignant normativity.
Well,
So what would
it
for
becomes
Adorno?
part of the malignant web. I mean,
Yeah.
if you've ever gone to a corporate happy hour, I mean, I have patients who work in corporations, and to disentangle anything they might be saying from the corporate jargon is a lot of work. Yeah, yeah, it's a different kind of authenticity, right? Yeah, so it's not that presumably one might have a whiff of sociability that would be more real, but to see the work of maintaining normality and maintaining deceit in a lot of social intercourse is important. That's what he's talking about. Yeah. I mean, the active work of denial that goes on constantly. Yeah.
And just one question, since we have a little bit of time. What could be the principles that Adorno sees for authenticity? Because I'm thinking from Lacan, let's say, the production of your own kind of master signifier, the connection of truth and knowledge, kind of the process of getting at that, could be kind of the authentic or the genuine. I'm trying to think that could be in Adorno, but do you have any kind of coordinates to how Adorno thinks authenticity of
Well, I'll say one thing about it, and then we'll ask Stephanie, because she's the authenticity expert. So the thing I would say is Adorno uses this term genuine this and genuine that. And that's his signal for, here's my concept of authentic truth, authentic morality, authentic relationship between thought and feeling, whatever. So it's not, you should eat whole wheat bread instead of this. It's not that kind of stuff. It's more like, there is genuine thought, and try to engage in it.
Right. But yeah, my question comes from trying to understand if there's an articulation of what constitutes genuine. But maybe Stephanie can say something.
Could I kind of bastardize what Hilda just said
Wait for them. Yeah.
and see if I can tease out a couple of words in the from okay, I'll sit closer. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of oversimplify where Hilda was going by asking if I can tease out some thoughts from you, of course, in this particular Adornian framework, about something as I said, it's going to be very simple, but in which way is all of this then kind of a dialectic between the principle and the value?
Between
Principles and values.
and knowledge?
No, principles and values.
Principles and values.
I I don't follow, actually. A dialectic between principles and values?
Yeah, like, I mean, we've heard things about, like, individual, that we can read individual, like, in what you presented. So, like, between, like, the principles, like, like that the individual adheres to, right? And the sense of values. Like, is there a...
Maybe that,
As I said,
I'm not
it's
connecting with Adorno as
oversimplified.
thinking in those terms.
Okay,
That's maybe,
fair.
but
That's
somebody
fair.
else might have something to
That's
say.
fair.
Yeah, for the genuine expert.
Like,
Help, yeah.
it's why, on the question of authenticity, I think that's as much an aesthetic question as it is an ethical or moral or political one, or psychological one. Those who have studied Adorno, and you've studied him, translated him more than most of us, the question of authenticity is an ongoing, continuous resistance to that which is inauthentic, right? But the evidence for this, not just psychoanalytically, but the evidence for this is in the aesthetic work. And I think in his essays on music, which you know better than probably than anyone, the totality, the configuration that goes beyond representation of the individual is where the experience of authenticity, if one is brave enough and open enough to the experience, to the Erfahrung, one can find evidence for this kind of authenticity. But I would say that the authenticity is in the aesthetic configuration of the work itself. If you translate that aesthetic configuration back into some concept of the individual, or the individuum in the individual, who is an unfinished project, one gets some sense of what he means by the genuine, right? Whatever that word, the danger of that word falling into the trap, going into the trap of belonging your patient, belonging to the corporation, belonging, right, to the community, which is what Lifton was, I take it, what Lifton was saying, that the normal path is the most dangerous person, but doesn't know it. Has no insight into its own malignant narcissism.
That Ernst B. had a good friend. No, he didn't want to participate in selections at the ramp when they were bringing the Jews. So he got somebody in Berlin to send someone to take his place. And that guy did it one day and then became catatonic, and which apparently was not that unusual. And so in the morning, they kind of got him and prescribed a psychotherapeutic protocol for him, which consisted of he'd get to work with this very famous prisoner doctor. And yeah, because he had said, no, I didn't come, I'm a doctor, I believe in living, not killing. And he then decided that he could finish his doctoral dissertation by staying there and taking their offer of working with this famous guy. So what you were saying reminded me of that, in the sense that there was some initial, it's obvious this is no good. Obvious, I can't bear it, I'm gonna wipe my consciousness out. But the resistance couldn't hold up. It succumbed to temptation. So, but I still want to hear what Stephanie says.
Sure. So this is definitely something that I'm still working through.
Yeah.
But I think that for Adorno, the concept of authenticity, at least in relation to someone like Heidegger, is really grounded in the rejection of like reified society and also in the rejection of the subject-object duality. So it's really about like that process, it is an ongoing process of restoring that dialectical relationship between subject and object. But then I also think that in negative dialectics, like at the end, or not at the end, but in the introduction, Adorno kind of has this utopian view as well that maybe could be his concept of authenticity, where he says, a right condition would be freed from dialectics, no more system than contradiction. So it's like, it's that process of, you know, embracing the contradiction to restore that dialectical relationship between subject and object, but then also going beyond that.
Maybe, yeah.
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 Yeah, that helps. Yeah, thank you, thank you. So, Alison, that's it? Well, if there's no any other question, we will wrap up here. And please help me to thank Shierry Nicholsen for the beautiful talk.